Hi, I'm Dhanashree Rajamani, and today we are going to be seeing about fairness in large language models. This is the Medium article I've written, which is a survey on fairness in large language models. And here is the research paper. It's an IEEE published research paper. So I have referred to this research paper primarily and have written an article that's based out of this research paper. And also there are a couple of other references that I have used. In this article, we're going to be seeing about how there are different kinds of large language models, and how fair are these models, what are the evaluation methods that we're using, how does bias occur, like what are the reasons for bias to occur, and what are the steps and techniques that can be taken in order to ensure or improve the fairness in these large language models, so that bias is reduced. All right. Yes, to begin with, as we have seen that large language models currently are very powerful in terms of their performance, and there are base foundation in many of the real world applications that we see. But it is also important to acknowledge the fact that these large language models also come with some limitations. What kind of limitations are we talking about in this context is that these large language models, they tend to pick up and even magnify social biases. So these social biases, it basically comes from the data that these models are being trained on. These biases that occur, it also happens to be an outcome in the applications that they are used in, and this could have negative social consequences. So in this article, we're going to see about fairness research in large language models, and there are two types of these models, so the medium scale and large scale models. How fairness is evaluated and debiased in medium scale models, as well as the latest research on fairness and how biases occur and how they can be mitigated in the larger models. This article will be covering all of these. Um, all right, we'll also touch upon what the ongoing challenges in these areas are, and what are the future possibilities in making LLMs fairer. All right. All right. So, as we just discussed, these are the topics that are being covered in this article. All right. Now, let's move to the introduction part of the article. In the introduction part, here is a figure which we will take a look at shortly. There are many large language models that we have known of and have even used. For example, it's BERT, GPT-3, and Llama models. So these models are very effective in some tasks like natural language processing, and they've also made a significant impact on real world applications. These models are trained on a wide range of data set, and these data set are from various sources. But based on research, we are able to see that these models, they inherit social biases from these data sets, and this is reflected in the outputs and in the downstream tasks that uses these models. So because of this, there will be discriminatory and biased decisions against certain groups of people, and this causes a potential harm. This is not correct. so um, and as we can see, so this comes from the training data. So this data set contains biases within them or some kind of harmful information that leads the model to adopt such stereotypical behaviors. So it is important to have balanced data set. So because the data set is imbalanced in terms of demographic groups, or also there is lack of diversity in the data, that's why it leads to skewed predictions. All right. So what do we do in order to handle this? All right. So before we go there, first let's take a look at what are the different kinds of biases that occur in each of these model kinds. So as we saw, there is medium scale large language models and large scale large language models. So uh, and also another thing is that language models, they can be categorized into two paradigms based on their training framework. So one is pre-training and fine-tuning, and the other one is prompting paradigm. So in case of a medium scale large language model, there will be less than a billion parameters, and they're easier to tune. Whereas in prompting paradigm, the large scale and there are more than billion parameters. So of course, it takes considerably more effort in order to tune this. And in medium scale models, we can see that there are two kinds of bias, namely intrinsic bias and extrinsic bias. So intrinsic bias are the ones that are related to the encodings, and it affects the output representation, whereas extrinsic bias is it occurs in the decision, like after the model is used in the downstream task, in the decision making process, when there is a bias that occurs, it is called an extrinsic bias. In prompting paradigm, in large scale models, we can see that these biases are often seen in response to specific prompts. All right. So now we have seen that there are different kinds of models, large language models, and there are different types of biases that come with it, and how the data set affects these kind of bias. So next is we're going to be looking at the evaluation metrics within these large language models, for the fairness, evaluating the fairness in these large language models. So there are two types of metrics, just like we saw now. It's intrinsic and extrinsic. And how intrinsic metrics, it focuses on analyzing the embeddings in order to measure the inherent bias or in associations of targets and concepts, whereas extrinsic bias, it tries to evaluate the bias in the downstream tasks of the application. So going further, intrinsic metrics, let's take a look at in detail about these intrinsic and extrinsic metrics. So, with respect to intrinsic metrics, there are two types, namely distance based and probability based metrics. So, in distance based metrics, it evaluates bias by determining the distance between vectors in the model's embedding space. So, in order to give an example of distance based metrics, there are tools like SEAT, which is Sentence Embedding Association Test, and CEAT, which is Contextualized Embedding Association Text. So, these are some example of distance based metrics. Okay, so how do they measure bias? So they measure how closely different concepts, like so gender, professions, these are different concepts. It measures how closely they are represented in the model's understanding. So how they're represented in the model based on like how closely they are. That's what distance based metrics talks about. Whereas in case of we have probability based metrics. So in probability based metrics, it analyzes biases. It assesses biases by analyzing the probabilities that the model assigns to different words or phrases in given context. So there are some techniques like DISCO, which is discovery of correlations, log probability bias score LPBS, and stereo set, Crowes pairs, and AUL. They all fall under this category. So the focus is to understand like how likely a model is to associate certain words or concepts with others based on stereotypical or societal biases. So these are the two kinds of intrinsic metrics that we have seen about. Next, let's take a look at what extrinsic metrics are. So as we saw, this is like in extrinsic metrics for gender bias. In case of gender bias evaluation, various methods and data sets are used. So this will provide us insight into how models handle gender related information. So there are methods like co-reference resolution and semantic similarity and group fairness that would help us to measure bias using extrinsic metrics. So in terms of when we talk about co-reference resolution, it's nothing but it involves measuring gender bias in tasks where the focus is on how well a model will perform or how well a model can associate gender pronouns with occupations. So some of the data sets here are Vino bias, Vino gender, and gap. So these are some of the data sets. So in each of these, it examines the model's ability to link gender pronouns with occupations, and in terms of stereotypical as well as non-stereotypical concepts. So, in terms of next type, which is semantic similarity, it assesses associations between gender and occupation. So, by it takes semantic similarity into consideration, like between sentence pairs, and these also has a few data sets that is used in these models, as shown here. It's STSB and bias NLI. Next, we have something called group fairness. So, group fairness, it involves measuring the performance gap of models across different groups. So some of the important data sets here are given here, like the data sets that are used in this research in order to researchers in order to like how these biases are measured in order to assess that. All right, so now we've seen that there are different kinds of bias that occurs, and how there are different metrics in place in order to evaluate these bias. Next, we're going to be looking at debiasing. So what is intrinsic debiasing? So intrinsic debiasing, basically it focuses on reducing biases in language model representations before they're used in downstream tasks. So, and another important factor to note is that these are task agnostic, which is they're very generic and does not depend on the specific task. So there are three major categories within intrinsic debiasing, which is pre-processing, in-processing, and post-processing. So now let's take a look at each of these types. So in pre-processing, this is nothing but these methods. It'll involve debiasing. It'll involve debiasing in training. That is before the model training begins. That's why it's called pre-processing. That's why we debiasing techniques are addressed before the training begins. So they're focused on creating a more balanced and less biased data set. So here there are a couple of approaches called CDA based approach and data calibration. So CDA based is nothing but it's counterfactual data augmentation. So it's used for balancing labels across demographic groups in training data. So for example, if there is something a sentence like he is a doctor, so that is it's a binary gender debiasing basically, so it's converted as she is a doctor. So but this method alone is not sufficient, but this is one of those techniques that will offer some strategies and for better results. Then the next process is called data calibration. So this is also involving strategies that has something to do with making our data set more fairer. So by filtering the biased text as much as possible, so it's basically identifying and removing any harmful text or subtext that occurs within our data set, but this is done programmatically. So that's what data calibration is. Next, in processing, let's take a look at the in processing methods within intrinsic debiasing. So in processing methods, it integrates fairness directly into the designs of large language models, and it aims to produce fairer models by adjusting their parameters. So some of the key approaches here are retraining optimization, disentanglement, alignment constraint, and contrastive learning. So let's take a quick look at what each of these techniques mean. So in retraining optimization, it involves retraining the models in order to reduce the bias. So there are techniques like dropout regularization, which disrupt, which help to lessen the gendered correlations. So for example, um, um, there's also this another method called knowledge fair knowledge distillation, where there's a teacher model with fairer output probabilities, and it guides the training of a student model. So in case of disentanglement, it aims to remove bias while retaining the valuable information. So it works by separating correlated concepts into orthogonal subspaces. Next is alignment constraint. So this strategy will involve aligning the model representations more closely across different sensitive attributes. So there are techniques like auto debias, which will maximize dissimilarity between demographic groups. So this will minimize the differences using alignment constraints. Then we have contrastive learning. So in this method, it focuses on narrowing the distance between positive samples and different populations. So while increasing the distance between negative pairs. So this is what contrastive learning is all about. Next, we have something called post processing. So post processing methods is nothing but it will involve adjusting the output of pre-trained LLMs without altering their underlying parameters. So we have projection based methods, parameter efficient techniques, and contrastive learning. So in projective based methods, there are techniques that will remove bias from the representations by linearly distinguishing between sensitive and neutral attributes. So in parameter efficient techniques, in order to prevent the loss of original training information, which is called as catastrophic forgetting, these methods introduce modifications that are less intrusive to model's core parameters. In terms of contrastive learning, it's a post since it's a post processing stage, so it'll this is applied to reduce the intrinsic bias. So for example, if there is tools like Fairfill, which employs a neural debiasing method within a contrastive learning framework, training a fair filter after the LLM's encoder. So this will make embeddings of similar pattern pairs more alike. Thereby, it will mitigate the gender bias in representations. Next, we'll take a look at extrinsic debiasing. So, extrinsic debiasing, as we already saw, it will try to reduce the bias in downstream applications of LLMs. So the primary goal here is to ensure that the model delivers consistent and fair output. Um, so the main difference is that this is done in a task specific manner, whereas intrinsic debiasing was task agnostic, but this is task specific. And there are two major categories here. They're called model centric debiasing and data centric debiasing. All right. So let's take a look at what data centric debiasing is. So data centric debiasing, it will focus on rectifying issues in the training data, such as imbalance, harmful information, or the data distribution. So some techniques within data-centric debiasing are data augmentation, data calibration, and instance weighing. So in data augmentation, we're addressing the imbalance in text classification. Like for example, if a term like gay may be overrepresented in toxic content, so this will associate model with negative labels. So data augmentation will focus on balancing the corpus so that there is robustness and fairness. Next is data calibration, in which we enhance the data quality for specific tasks. There might be data which is not having gender balance, so we aim to create data set that has more gender balance or balanced data set in general. And then we have instance weighing. So in instance weighing, what we do is that it's a strategy which manipulates the weight of each training instance, such as reducing the weight of biased instances in order to decrease their influence on the model. So, again, in order to make the model more fairer, we will reduce, if there is any, we'll try to reduce the weight, because it's got something to do with weight. We'll reduce the weight of the uh, text which is having bias in its context. So the next technique that we're going to be looking at is model centric debiasing. So in model centric debiasing, the technique is to focus on incorporating fairness objectives directly into the model's learning process. So there are four key approaches here as well. So it's called regularization constraint, adversarial learning, auxiliary classifier, and contrastive learning. So in terms of regularization constraint, so it's like we're adding a fairness objective to the training process of downstream tasks. So we'll penalize any spurious features and using masked language models to in training to optimize both accuracy and fairness. Next is adversarial learning, and in this approach, we'll hide any sensitive information from the decision making process. And then we have auxiliary classifier, where these are added to the main model to predict the target attribute and assist in debiasing, and there are multiple techniques within this as well. And then we have contrastive learning, where we optimize the classifier training more efficiently. So this approach will cluster instances by class label rather than sensitive attributes. So let's take a look at evaluating how are we evaluating fairness in large language models. So talking about fairness of large language models, as they are continuously like rapidly advancing, it is evident that there are also concerns about fairness that keeps increasing with this. So we have to look at how these evaluating methods work, and what are the source of bias and what are the debiasing techniques. So we'll see an overview of each of these topics. So in order to evaluate fairness in large language models, like for example, we have large scale models like GPT-3 and GPT-4, and we have seen that in GPT-3 there are output related to gender, race, religion, and violence, which causes bias. Also, in terms of Chat GPT or GPT 4, it you there is it uses an automated framework in order to measure the social bias in conversational AI. So chat G- in general, research has showed that ChatGPT and GPT-4, it shows varying levels of bias, but it's based on the topic that's being talked about and the scenarios that are being given. So it's also evident that GPT-4 is found to be more accurate, but they're less fair in imbalanced environments. So, there is complexity and challenge in achieving fairness in large language models. So, that is something that's very clear based on this research. Okay, so what are the reason for model bias? So, it has been the research has shown that there has been significant leap in the capabilities of models like GPT-4 and Llama, and also the kind of biases that has been coming up has also been changing. So there is a need for coming up with continuous evaluation strategies to understand what the reason for model bias are. So, for example, in Llama 2, there is uneven frequency of gender pronouns and identity terms in training data, which is causing a bias. And in GPT-4 as well, there is a gender bias, and also this gender bias associates with various occupations, but it mirrors how the real world gender distribution in that field is. So there is also an NLP positionality framework which will assess the bias in data sets and models, and finds that it favors groups which are more privileged, or at least considered to be privileged, than the other groups, or the groups that are being affected because of this, such as non-native English speakers or non-binary individuals. So let's take a look at debiasing large scale LLMs. So, in order to debias large scale LLMs like GPT-4 and Llama 2, there are techniques. This is more challenging than medium scale models, but there are techniques like fine tuning and prompt engineering that will help us get there. So, instruction fine tuning is nothing but it involves training the models on data sets which are formatted as instructions. It uses techniques like RLHF basically. Um, and in terms of prompt engineering, it involves crafting prompts in order to guide the model towards fairer output. Uh, Next is a discussion on the fairness in both medium scale large language models and larger scale large language models. So, fairness is a critical concern in both of these models. It's important to create a model which is does socially responsible and comprehensive. So, now we'll take a look at what are the limitations, challenges, and future research in these aspects. So, one of the major limitation would include the fact that both these extrinsic metrics, there are extrinsic metrics, intrinsic metrics, but there is no clear correlation between the extrinsic and intrinsic metrics. Even after various factors like bias and dataset noise are adjusted, so since there is no proper correlation here, this just makes it more complicated uh, to perform these debias research. So this is a major limitation that is involved in this area. So, accurately evaluating fairness in large language models is more challenging in larger scale. Large language models is more challenging than in medium scale, because there are no comprehensive methods and heavy. It relies on models' responses. Like we just saw, we were relying on instruction fine tuning and prompt engineering. So, in order to increase accuracy in bias assessment, so it's necessary to use automated techniques with applying statistical principles in order to overcome the limitation and the potential bias of human judgment. So, currently, we can see that fairness evaluations are also limited by data sets, and they do not accurately represent the model. So, what do we do for this? So that's why there is still research that is needed in these fields. So on further exploration for reason for bias, we can see that models are analyzed based on how the stereotype are in real world. And they also vary in scale and perspective, and they're a reflection of how the world operates. So because they're based on the data that is used in the world every day. So there is a necessity to make our data sets with more diversity, and to ensure that there is fairness in these models. So, what are some of the debiasing techniques for large scale LLMs? So, in large scale models, since we rely on prompt engineering and instruction fine tuning, there is a necessity, like in future strategies, we could probably involve more designing more sophisticated prompt templates. And also, as these LLMs grow in terms of their influence as well as their applications, it is important to have more than just training strategies. So proper solution for all which would comprehensively cover all the areas, like in data selection, processing, and model architecture, right from the development stage. So this will ensure fairness throughout the model. So, taking a look at the conclusion of this article as well as the research paper, so it highlights that the bias that occurs in models, large language models, is mainly stemming from the data set that it's been trained on, which contains harmful and imbalanced information. So we also saw some evaluation metrics, debiasing strategies for medium scale LLMs, and also how we can examine the fairness, source of bias, and debiasing methods for large scale large language models. So, in order to address these challenges and potential researches, it is a very crucial area, and that has to be done to develop more fairer LLMs. And there is a need to research in these areas where we can evaluate and mitigate bias and develop a more comprehensive, safer, robust large scale large language model systems. Thank you.